"Ma'am, step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where I can see them." The words cut clean through the humid evening air, sharp and practiced, like they'd been said 1,000 times before, but this time they landed differently, heavier, as if the silence around them knew something was off before anyone else did. Ava Carter didn't move right away. Her fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, knuckles still, breath slow, the faint glow of the dashboard casting a soft blue light across her face. Outside, red and blue lights flickered against the windows of nearby storefronts, stretching across glass like broken reflections. A few people had already stopped walking, their heads turning, phones subtly lifting. Officer Daniel Brooks stood just outside her driver's side window, one hand resting near his belt, the other gesturing again, firmer this time. "I said step out." Ava blinked once, steady, then reached for the handle and pushed the door open. The sound was small, almost swallowed by the low hum of distant traffic and the quiet crackle of the police radio clipped to his shoulder. She stepped out slowly, sneakers touching the pavement, the night air brushing against her skin. She could smell faint asphalt, something metallic in the air, and underneath it all, the sharp scent of tension that didn't belong to her. Brooks' eyes scanned her quickly, not really looking, more like confirming something he had already decided. "Turn around," he said. Ava did. No hesitation. Her backpack slid slightly off her shoulder as she moved, the zipper catching a sliver of light. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked, tone flat, almost bored. Ava shook her head. "No, sir." Her voice was calm, even, the kind of calm that didn't try to prove anything. It just existed. Behind them, a car slowed, then stopped entirely. Someone across the street leaned against a lamppost, pretending not to watch. Brooks stepped closer, close enough that his shadow cut across her feet. There was a pause, just a second too long, like a beat missed in a song. Then he moved. Quick, precise, his hand brushing near the side of her backpack, and something small dropped to the pavement between them. A soft, almost weightless sound. Both of them looked down. A small plastic bag, pale against the dark ground. Brooks didn't react immediately. Then his boot shifted forward, stopping just short of it. "Well," he said slowly, his voice changing, tightening. "What do we have here?" The air seemed to pull inward. Ava's eyes stayed on the object for half a second, then lifted back up to him. No panic. No confusion. Just stillness. The kind that made noise feel louder. "That's not mine," she said quietly. Brooks let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "They always say that." His radio crackled again, static cutting through the moment, but neither of them moved. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera adjusted focus, the faint click barely audible. Ava felt it, the weight of eyes, of assumptions already forming in the spaces between whispers. Brooks reached for his cuffs, metal catching the flashing lights, reflecting red, then blue, then red again. "Turn around," he repeated, firmer now. Ava didn't resist. She placed her hands behind her back, wrists steady, her pulse measured, like she was following instructions she had memorized long before tonight. As the cold metal touched her skin, she spoke again, just above a whisper, calm enough to cut through the noise. "Are you sure you want to do this?" For a split second, something flickered across Brooks' face. Not doubt. Not yet. But something close to irritation, like a question he didn't want asked. He tightened the cuffs anyway. "You're in no position to be asking questions." Ava's gaze drifted past him for a moment, toward the growing crowd, toward the blinking lights reflecting in the glass of a closed diner, then back to him. Her expression didn't change. "Then let me make one call." The words didn't rise. They didn't push. They simply landed, quiet and certain, in the middle of a moment that was already starting to crack. The metal clicked into place with a finality that seemed louder than it should have been, the kind of sound that lingered a fraction too long in the air, like it wanted to be remembered. Ava Carter did not pull away. She did not twist or protest. Her wrists stayed steady behind her back, shoulders relaxed, chin level, as if she had stepped into a moment she had already seen before. Around them, the small crowd thickened just enough to feel real, not large enough to intervene, but present enough to witness. A man across the street adjusted his stance, lifting his phone higher, the screen glowing faintly against his face. A woman near the corner store leaned closer to another, whispering something that did not quite reach words. The red and blue lights continued their rhythm, washing over everything in pulses that made the scene feel unreal, like a loop repeating itself. Officer Daniel Brooks exhaled through his nose, glancing briefly at the small plastic bag still resting near his boot, then back at Ava. "You think one phone call is going to fix this?" he asked, his voice edged with something sharper now, less casual, more controlled. Ava did not answer immediately. She shifted her weight slightly, just enough to settle her stance, the cuffs glinting under the flashing lights. "I am not trying to fix anything," she said quietly. "I am asking for one call." The distinction hung between them, subtle but precise. Brooks studied her for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing just slightly, as if searching for something beneath the calm. Most people in this position filled the silence with urgency, with explanations, with fear that spilled out in uneven words. She did none of that. She simply stood there, waiting. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, a dispatcher's voice cutting in and out, mentioning another call a few blocks away, something about a disturbance, but Brooks did not respond. His attention stayed fixed on her. "You already said it was not yours," he said, almost dismissive. "That is your statement." Ava nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then there is nothing else to say." Another pause, the kind that stretched just enough to make the edges of the moment sharpen. Ava's gaze drifted briefly toward the patrol car, toward the mounted camera on the dash, then back to him. "Then let the call say it for me." It was not defiance. It was not pleading. It was something else entirely, something measured, like a step placed exactly where it needed to be. Brooks let out a short breath, glancing over his shoulder at the growing line of bystanders. He could feel it now, the subtle shift in the air, the attention no longer passive, the weight of being watched settling more heavily on his shoulders. His jaw tightened slightly. Control mattered. Appearances mattered. He reached toward his belt, pulling out a phone, then hesitated for half a second before handing it to her. "One call," he said. "Put it on speaker." Ava accepted it carefully, her fingers brushing the edge of the device, her movements unhurried despite the metal at her wrists. She adjusted her grip, then used her thumb to press the screen awake. For a brief moment, the light illuminated her face more clearly, revealing nothing but focus. She did not scroll. She did not search. She entered the number directly, each digit deliberate, as if memorized long before tonight. The ringing began, soft at first, then clearer as the speaker carried it into the open air. One ring. 2. 3. Brooks shifted his stance, crossing his arms loosely, the posture meant to signal patience. But his eyes remained fixed on her, watching for any crack, any sign that this was just another attempt to delay the inevitable. The fourth ring stretched slightly longer. Then the line clicked. A voice answered, calm and immediate. "This line is secure. Identify yourself." Ava did not hesitate. "This is Ava Carter." A brief silence on the other end. Not confusion, not delay, but recognition settling into place. "Proceed." Brooks' expression flickered, just for a second, something small but noticeable, like a question forming before it could be dismissed. Ava lifted her eyes to meet his, her voice still even, still controlled. "I am requesting that you listen carefully." The crowd had grown quieter now, the whispers fading into a low hum, as if something in the tone of the call had shifted the atmosphere without anyone fully understanding why. Brooks straightened slightly, his attention sharpening despite himself. "Put the officer on the line," the voice said. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The authority in it carried cleanly through the speaker, cutting through the noise with a precision that felt different from everything that had come before. Ava did not move right away. She simply held Brooks' gaze for a fraction of a second longer, then extended the phone toward him, her cuffed hand steady, her expression unchanged. "They would like to speak with you," she said. The words were simple, but the silence that followed them was not. For a moment, Officer Daniel Brooks did not take the phone. It hovered between them, suspended in the narrow space where authority usually settled without question. The flashing lights reflected across the screen, red then blue then red again, casting shifting colors across Ava Carter's steady hands. The voice on the other end did not repeat itself. It simply waited. Brooks glanced at the small crowd, at the raised phones, at the quiet that had deepened into something heavier than curiosity. Then he reached out and took the device. His fingers closed around it, firm, controlled, like everything else about him. "This is Officer Brooks," he said, bringing it closer, his tone clipped, official. "Who am I speaking with?" There was no immediate answer. Just a brief pause, not uncertain, not hesitant, but deliberate, as if the silence itself carried weight. Then the voice returned, calm and precise. "Officer Brooks, you are currently on an active recording line. Confirm that your body camera is engaged." Brooks' jaw tightened slightly. He instinctively glanced down at the small device clipped to his chest, its indicator light blinking steadily. "It is standard procedure," he replied, choosing his words carefully. That was not the question. The voice said, still even, still controlled. "Confirm that your body camera is recording." Another pause. This one shorter. "Yes," Brooks said. The word came out flat, but something beneath it had shifted, just slightly, like the ground under a step that did not feel as solid as expected. Across from him, Ava remained still, her gaze no longer fixed on him but slightly past, as if she was listening to something deeper than the exchange itself. The voice continued. "Good. Then we will proceed with clarity." Brooks' grip on the phone adjusted, his fingers pressing a little tighter along the edge. "Proceed with what?" he asked, a hint of impatience threading into his tone. "With documentation," the voice answered. "Officer Brooks, you initiated a stop at approximately 9:14 p.m. You made contact with a civilian identified as Ava Carter. You conducted a search and claimed to have discovered contraband. Is that correct?" The words were not accusatory. They were structured, methodical, like lines being drawn on a page. Brooks straightened slightly, aware now of how every word might land, not just here, but later. "Yes," he said. "That is correct. Describe the sequence of discovery," the voice instructed. A faint ripple moved through the crowd, not loud enough to break the moment, but enough to signal that something had shifted. This was no longer just an interaction. It was being framed, measured. Brooks inhaled, once steadying his tone. "During a lawful stop, I observed suspicious behavior. Upon further inspection, I identified a small bag consistent with illegal substances near the individual." The phrasing was clean, practiced. He had said variations of it before. It fit easily into place. On the other end of the line, there was another pause. Then, near the individual, the voice repeated, slightly slower. "Clarify proximity." Brooks' eyes flicked briefly toward the ground, toward the exact spot where the bag had landed, then back up. "Within immediate reach," he said. The voice did not respond right away. Instead, a different sound entered the line, faint at first, then clearer. The subtle click of keys, the quiet hum of a system accessing something already in motion. Ava's head tilted just slightly, not toward the phone, but toward the patrol car behind them, where the dash camera continued to record without interruption. "Officer Brooks," the voice said again, "be advised that we are reviewing synchronized footage from both your body camera and your vehicle camera in real time." The words settled differently. Heavier. More specific. Brooks felt it then, the shift he could not quite name before, now forming into something clearer. Not doubt. Not yet. But pressure. Controlled, precise pressure. He adjusted his stance again. The movement subtle, almost unnoticeable, but his shoulders no longer sat as easily as before. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone still firm, but no longer casual. Ava's eyes returned to him then, steady, calm, the same calm that had not wavered since the moment he asked her to step out of the car. She said nothing. She did not need to. The voice on the phone answered instead. "That depends," it said quietly, "on whether your description aligns with the footage we are observing." The silence that followed was no longer empty. It carried weight, expectation, and something else now, something that had not been there before. Brooks did not speak immediately. For the first time, the rhythm he controlled so easily had shifted just slightly out of sync. In the distance, another set of headlights approached, slowing as it neared the scene, the faint outline of a second patrol vehicle becoming visible under the glow of the streetlights. Ava's gaze flicked toward it for a fraction of a second, then back to him. Brooks noticed. He could not help it. And in that moment, something small but undeniable moved through him. Not fear, not yet, but awareness, sharp and sudden, that this was no longer just a stop, no longer just a report, and whatever came next was already in motion long before he ever stepped out of his car. The approaching headlights did not rush in. They slowed, deliberate, controlled, as if whoever was behind the wheel already knew exactly where they were going and why. The second patrol vehicle rolled to a stop several yards behind Brooks' cruiser, its engine idling low, steady, the hum blending into the quiet tension that now filled the street. No siren, no urgency, just presence. Brooks' eyes flicked toward it, then back to the phone in his hand, then briefly to Ava Carter, who had not moved an inch. Her posture remained the same, wrists secured behind her back, shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, as if the scene unfolding around her was not something happening to her, but something she had been waiting to see completed. Officer Brooks, the voice on the phone continued, calm as before. I advise you to remain where you are. The phrasing was careful, not a request, not quite an order either. Something in between, something that carried authority without needing to raise its volume. Brooks' grip tightened slightly around the phone. I am already where I am supposed to be, he replied, but the certainty in his voice had thinned, just enough to be noticed by anyone listening closely. The door of the second vehicle opened. One figure stepped out first, then another. Their movements were unhurried, measured, like they were stepping into a situation that had already been decided before they arrived. The first officer adjusted the front of their jacket, the faint outline of a badge catching the light as they walked forward. The second followed a step behind, scanning the scene, eyes moving from the crowd to the vehicles to Brooks, then finally settling, briefly, on Ava. No words were exchanged yet. They did not need to be. Brooks shifted his stance again, this time more visibly. The weight in the air had changed. It was no longer just attention from bystanders or the presence of a call on speaker. It was something official now, something that had structure, direction. He brought the phone slightly closer to his ear, lowering his voice just a fraction. Who exactly is this? He asked. There was no delay in the response. Captain Rebecca Hayes, the voice answered. Internal Affairs. The words landed clean, without emphasis, without dramatics. They did not need any. For a fraction of a second, the rhythm of the moment paused entirely, like everything had been placed on hold just long enough for the meaning to settle into place. Brooks' expression did not collapse. It did not break. But something in it tightened, the edges becoming sharper, less relaxed, as if every small movement now had to be calculated instead of automatic. Understood, he said, the word precise, controlled. Behind him, the two arriving officers continued their approach, closing the distance step by step. Their boots made soft contact with the pavement, each step measured, not hurried, not slow, just exact. Ava watched them without turning her head fully, her eyes shifting just enough to track their movement, then returning to Brooks. Her expression had not changed. Not once. Officer Brooks, Captain Hayes continued, you are going to listen carefully now. He did not interrupt. He did not question. Not this time. You will secure the scene as it stands, she said. You will not alter, move, or reframe any item currently visible. You will keep your body camera active. You will not disengage from this location until directed. Each instruction came one after another, steady, deliberate, like steps being placed into a sequence that had already been outlined. Brooks swallowed once, subtle enough that most would not notice, but it was there. And the individual? He asked, glancing briefly toward Ava, as if seeing her position for the first time not as something he controlled, but as something that was now part of a larger process. There was a brief pause on the line. Then, you will maintain her safety, Hayes said. Not detain, not restrain. The wording was different. Intentional. The distinction did not go unnoticed. The two officers reached the edge of the scene, stopping just short of Brooks. The one in front spoke first, voice low, professional. Officer Brooks. It was not a greeting. It was acknowledgement. Brooks turned slightly toward them, still holding the phone, still aware of the line that remained open. What is this about? He asked, though the answer was already forming in the space between all of them. The second officer stepped forward just enough to meet his line of sight. We are here to observe and document, they said. Calm, direct. No explanation beyond that. Ava's gaze dropped briefly to the pavement, to the small plastic bag still resting exactly where it had fallen, untouched, unchanged. Then she lifted her eyes again, steady, quiet, present. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, but the scene no longer felt like something unfolding randomly. It felt structured now, contained within something larger than any single moment. Brooks stood in the center of it, phone in hand, badge on his chest, lights behind him, eyes on him. And for the first time since the stop began, the space around him no longer belonged to him alone. The space between everyone tightened without anyone stepping closer. It was not the distance that changed, it was the weight inside it, the kind that pressed quietly against the chest and made every breath feel just a little more deliberate. Officer Daniel Brooks stood still, the phone still in his hand, the line still open. The presence of Captain Rebecca Hayes no longer just a voice, but something that had taken shape around him. The two officers who had arrived did not move to take over. They did not reach for Ava Carter or the evidence on the ground. They simply stood, watching, documenting, letting the moment hold itself exactly as it was. Ava remained where she had been, wrists secured, posture unchanged, her gaze steady and quiet, like she was listening to something deeper than the words being exchanged. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, but now each pulse seemed to outline the scene more sharply. Every detail more visible, more permanent. "Officer Brooks," Hayes said through the phone, her tone unchanged. "I want you to walk me through your decision to initiate the search." Brooks inhaled slowly, drawing in the warm night air, the faint scent of pavement and engine heat grounding him in something physical. "There was behavior that raised concern," he said, choosing each word carefully, aware now that every syllable carried weight beyond this street. "Define the behavior," Hayes replied immediately. No pause. No space to generalize. Brooks' eyes flicked briefly toward Ava, then away, scanning the street as if the answer might be written somewhere else. "The individual appeared nervous," he said. The words sounded thinner this time, less anchored. Hayes did not respond right away. The silence stretched, not empty, but evaluative, like something was being compared against something else unseen. In the distance, a car door closed, a soft echo that barely touched the edges of the moment. Ava's breathing remained steady, her shoulders rising and falling in a calm rhythm that did not match the tension surrounding her. One of the observing officers shifted slightly, adjusting their stance, but did not speak. Hayes' voice returned, just as measured as before. "Officer Brooks, we are reviewing the footage in real time." The statement did not accuse. It clarified. Brooks' jaw set a fraction tighter. "Then you can see what I see," he replied, though the certainty behind the statement no longer carried the same ease it had earlier. Ava's eyes moved briefly toward the patrol car again, toward the camera mounted inside, its lens fixed, unblinking. Then back to Brooks. "We can see more than that," Hayes said. The words were quiet, but they landed with precision. "We can see sequence." The street seemed to hold its breath. Brooks did not respond immediately. His gaze dropped, almost involuntarily, toward the small plastic bag still resting exactly where it had fallen. Untouched, unmoved. Then he looked back up, but the shift had already happened. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The certainty that had filled the space earlier had thinned, replaced by something else. Not fear. Not yet. But awareness, sharper now, more defined. "Officer Brooks," Hayes continued, "I am going to ask you a direct question." He straightened slightly, instinctively, as if bracing for something he could not yet fully name. "Did the item you identified originate from the individual's possession prior to your contact?" The question settled into the air, clear and unambiguous. No room for interpretation. No room for framing. Just fact. Brooks' grip on the phone tightened again, the edge pressing lightly into his palm. His eyes flicked once more toward Ava, but this time something in his gaze lingered, like he was seeing her position not just as part of the moment, but as something fixed within it. Ava met his gaze without hesitation. No anger. No challenge. Just presence. Waiting. The crowd had gone almost completely silent now. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed to fade, as if the entire street had narrowed down to this single exchange. Brooks opened his mouth slightly, then closed it. Again, the words not forming as easily as they had before. Hayes did not rush him. She did not repeat the question. She let it sit, letting the weight of it do its work. One of the observing officers shifted their attention subtly, their gaze moving from Brooks to the ground, then back again, noting everything without interruption. Ava's fingers flexed slightly against the restraint, not struggling, just adjusting, her breathing still steady, still controlled. The flashing lights reflected across her face, red then blue then red again. But her expression did not change. Brooks finally spoke, his voice lower now, more measured, but not as firm. The item was located near her, he said. Hayes did not respond immediately. The pause that followed was longer this time, deliberate, like a line being drawn slowly, carefully. Then her voice returned, just as calm, just as precise. That was not my question. The words did not rise. They did not press. But they closed in, narrowing the space between what had been said and what remained. Brooks felt it then, fully now, the shift that had been building since the moment the call connected. This was no longer about the stop. It was no longer about control. It was about alignment. Between words and footage. Between action and record. Between what happened and what could not be undone. And for the first time since the lights had come on behind Ava Carter's car, the silence around him no longer felt like something he could fill. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, slowly, like pressure releasing through something too small to see. Officer Daniel Brooks stood with the phone still in his hand, the question still hanging in the air, unchanged, unanswered in the way it had been asked. The flashing lights continued to move across the scene, painting everything in alternating colors, but now each reflection seemed to linger longer, as if the moment itself had slowed down to make room for what was unfolding. Ava Carter did not speak. She did not shift. Her presence remained steady, grounded, as if the weight of the situation had settled everywhere except on her. Her eyes stayed on Brooks, not demanding, not accusing, simply there, holding space without filling it. The two observing officers remained in position, their posture unchanged, their attention precise, taking in every detail without interruption. One of them glanced briefly toward the patrol car, then back again, as if confirming something that had already been seen. The small plastic bag on the pavement remained exactly where it had been, untouched, its position now more significant than it had been a moment before. Officer Brooks, Captain Rebecca Hayes said, her voice still calm, still measured, I will ask again. The repetition was not forceful. It did not need to be. It carried expectation instead, clear and unwavering. Brooks inhaled slowly, the air feeling heavier now, thicker, like it resisted movement. Did the item originate from the individual's possession prior to your contact? The question returned, unchanged, precise. Brooks' eyes dropped again, this time lingering a fraction longer on the ground, on the exact space between where Ava had been standing and where the item now rested. He could feel it, the alignment Hayes had spoken of earlier, tightening around him, narrowing the distance between what he said and what could be seen. His mind moved quickly, not in panic, but in calculation, searching for a version of the moment that would hold under observation, that would remain consistent no matter how many angles it was viewed from. But the footage was already there, already playing, already fixed. He lifted his gaze again, meeting Ava's eyes for a brief second. There was no reaction waiting for him there. No signal, just stillness. It was not directly in her hands, he said finally, the words coming slower now, more deliberate, shaped carefully as they left him. The silence that followed was immediate, but different. Not empty, not waiting. It felt like something had just shifted into place. Hayes did not respond right away. When she did, her voice was unchanged, but something beneath it had settled, like a decision had been reached without needing to be announced. Understood, she said. The word was simple, but it carried confirmation, not agreement. One of the observing officers stepped forward slightly, not enough to disrupt the scene, but enough to signal movement, intention. The other adjusted their position just behind, their gaze still steady, still attentive. Ava's shoulders lowered just a fraction, not relief, not release, but a subtle shift, like a breath finally allowed to complete itself. Brooks felt it then, fully, the difference between control and structure. Earlier, everything had moved through him, shaped by his decisions, his words, his authority. Now it moved around him, guided by something else, something already set in motion before he realized he was part of it. Officer Brooks, Hayes continued, you are going to keep your current position. Another instruction. Another step in a sequence he no longer directed. Do not disengage. Do not reposition. Remain exactly where you are. He nodded once, the motion small, automatic, though she could not see it. Yes, ma'am, he said. The title came out naturally, instinctively, the shift in hierarchy now fully acknowledged. The observing officer closest to him spoke then, their voice low, professional. "We are going to document the scene as it stands." Brooks did not respond. He did not need to. Ava's gaze shifted briefly toward the officer, then back to the ground, then up again, taking in everything without reacting to it. The camera on Brooks' chest continued to record, its small indicator light blinking steadily, capturing each second as it unfolded, preserving it without bias, without interpretation. The crowd had grown quieter still, the earlier whispers now replaced by a silence that felt almost intentional, like everyone present understood, even without knowing why, that something important was happening, something that could not be undone once it finished. Hayes' voice returned one more time, softer now, but no less clear. "We will proceed from here." The words were not an ending. They were a transition. Brooks stood there, the phone still in his hand, the scene still unfolding around him, and for the first time, there was no immediate next move he could make to change it. Only the recognition that whatever came next had already begun. The night air felt different now, not quieter, but heavier, like every second carried something that could not be taken back once it passed. Officer Daniel Brooks stood exactly where he had been told to stand, the phone still in his hand, though the line had gone silent for the moment, leaving behind only the faint echo of authority that had already reshaped everything around him. The two observing officers moved with quiet precision, one stepping closer to the small plastic bag on the pavement, stopping just short of it, careful not to disturb its position, while the other angled slightly toward Brooks' patrol car, eyes scanning the dashboard camera, confirming its steady recording. No one rushed. No one raised their voice. The entire scene unfolded with a calm that felt sharper than urgency. Ava Carter remained still, her wrists still secured behind her back, but something in her posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, not in defiance, not in relief, but in presence, like she no longer needed to hold herself against the moment because the moment had begun to hold itself. Her eyes followed the movement of the officer near the evidence, then returned to Brooks, not accusing, not questioning, simply observing. Brooks felt that gaze more now than before, not because it had changed, but because his awareness of it had. It was steady, unwavering, and it did not ask for anything. It simply existed. The officer nearest the ground spoke quietly, almost to themselves, but loud enough to be recorded. "Item remains in original position," they said, their voice neutral, factual. The second officer nodded slightly, their attention shifting between the body camera on Brooks' chest and the scene in front of them. "Recording is continuous," they added. Each word was small, precise, but together they built something larger, something structured, something that did not bend. Brooks swallowed once, his throat dry, though he had not realized it until now. His hand adjusted slightly around the phone, but he did not lift it, did not speak. There was nothing left to say that would change what had already been set in motion. Ava's fingers flexed again against the restraint, a subtle movement, controlled, like someone maintaining circulation, not struggling against it. The flashing lights reflected across her skin, across the pavement, across the faces of the small crowd that had now grown into a quiet ring of witnesses. No one stepped forward. No one intervened. They simply watched, phones held steady, eyes fixed, the weight of the moment settling into memory even as it unfolded. One of the observing officers turned slightly toward Ava then, their voice soft but clear. "Miss Carter," they said, "we are going to take care of this step by step." Ava nodded once. No words, just acknowledgement. Brooks noticed the shift in language again. Not suspect, not detainee. "Miss Carter." The distinction landed, quiet but undeniable. The officer did not move to remove the cuffs yet. They did not rush that step. Everything had a sequence now, a structure that could not be skipped. The second officer stepped closer to Brooks, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with intention. "Officer Brooks," they said, "we are going to need you to remain exactly as you are while we complete initial documentation." Brooks nodded once, the motion automatic, his voice coming quieter now than before. "Understood." The word felt different leaving his mouth this time, not a confirmation of control, but of compliance. The officer's gaze held on him for a second longer, then shifted away, continuing their assessment. The scene had fully transitioned now. It was no longer about what had been claimed. It was about what could be shown. Ava's gaze drifted briefly toward the patrol car again, toward the camera that had captured everything from the moment the lights first came on, then back to the ground, then to Brooks. Her expression remained unchanged, but there was something else there now, something quiet, something grounded. Not victory, not relief, just truth, steady and unmoving. Brooks felt it, even if he could not name it. The difference between holding a moment and being held inside one. The difference between speaking first and answering after. The difference between authority and accountability. The officer near the evidence spoke again, still calm, still precise. Scene integrity maintained, they said. The words were simple, but they carried weight, finality in their own way. Nothing had been moved. Nothing had been altered. Everything remained exactly as it had been when the question was first asked. Ava took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling evenly, her eyes lifting once more to meet Brooks. There was no anger in them, no satisfaction, just clarity. And in that clarity, something shifted again, not in the scene, not in the lights or the voices or the positions of anyone present, but in the understanding of it all. Brooks stood there, the badge still on his chest, the phone still in his hand, the cameras still recording, and for the first time, the silence around him did not feel like something waiting to be filled. It felt like something already answered. The rhythm of the scene had settled into something controlled, almost deliberate, like every movement now belonged to a sequence that had been written long before anyone arrived. The flashing lights continued their steady pulse, but they no longer felt chaotic. They felt like markers, each blink recording a moment that could not be erased. Ava Carter stood where she had been, her wrists still secured, but the tension that had once surrounded her had shifted outward, no longer pressing against her, now circling the space around Officer Daniel Brooks. The observing officers moved with quiet intention, one kneeling slightly to examine the ground without touching it, the other stepping toward the patrol car, leaning just enough to view the dashboard camera's angle. Their voices remained low, measured, every word spoken not for conversation, but for record. Timestamp aligns, one of them said, almost under their breath, though the body camera would catch every syllable. The other nodded once, eyes still scanning. Sequence is consistent. Brooks heard it. He could not avoid it. The words were not directed at him, but they moved through him anyway, settling somewhere deeper than sound. His hand loosened slightly around the phone, though he did not lower it. He remained exactly where he had been instructed, the stillness now something he followed, not something he chose. Ava's gaze shifted again, briefly toward the officer near the patrol car, then back to Brooks. Her expression had not changed, but there was a quiet awareness in it now, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. The crowd remained in place, a silent ring of witnesses, their phones steady, their movements minimal, as if even they understood that this moment did not need noise to carry its weight. One of the observing officers stood fully upright again, turning slightly toward Brooks, their posture calm, but their attention direct. "Officer Brooks," they said, their tone even, "we are going to begin formal review documentation." Brooks nodded once, the motion automatic, though his shoulders felt heavier than before. "Yes," he said quietly. The word did not echo. It settled. The officer's gaze held for a second longer, then shifted toward Ava. "Miss Carter," they said, their voice softening just slightly, "we are going to adjust your position." Ava nodded once. No hesitation. No question. The officer stepped behind her carefully, their movements precise, controlled, and after a brief moment, the sound of metal shifted, a subtle change, not loud, not dramatic, but noticeable in the silence that surrounded it. Ava brought her hands forward slowly, her wrists free now, her fingers flexing once, then resting naturally at her sides. She did not step away. She did not speak. She simply stood there, the same calm presence, unchanged by the shift except for the absence of restraint. Brooks watched it happen. He did not interrupt. He did not question. His gaze followed the movement of her hands, then returned to her face, then drifted away again, as if he was trying to locate something that no longer existed in the way it had before. The officer near the patrol car spoke again, their voice still measured. "Dash footage confirms initial contact point," they said. "No visible transfer from subject to ground." The words landed clearly, each one precise, each one narrowing the space between what had been claimed and what had been seen. Brooks' jaw tightened slightly, though he said nothing. The other officer added, "Body camera angle corroborates." Ava took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling evenly, her gaze lifting briefly toward the sky, then back down, grounding herself in the moment without needing to hold on to it. The flashing lights continued, but now they felt distant, like something happening behind the scene rather than within it. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, just enough to feel the ground beneath him again, to remind himself of where he stood. But the space did not feel the same. It no longer moved with him. It remained fixed, structured, defined by something beyond his control. One of the officers stepped closer to him again, not confrontational, not aggressive, just present. "We will continue documentation," they said. "Please remain where you are." Brooks nodded again. "Understood." The word came out softer this time, not weaker, but more grounded in acceptance than before. Ava's eyes moved back to him once more, steady, quiet, her expression unchanged, but the meaning within it clearer now. Not accusation, not triumph, just truth, standing exactly where it had always been. The officer near the ground made one final note, their voice low but clear. "No displacement observed." The statement settled into the air, completing something that had been building since the moment the question was first asked. The crowd remained silent. The cameras remained steady. The lights continued their rhythm. And in the center of it all, the moment no longer felt like something unfolding. It felt like something revealed. The moment did not escalate. It settled, like dust after something invisible had already fallen into place. Ava Carter stood with her hands now free at her sides, her fingers relaxed, no longer bound but not restless either, as if the absence of restraint had simply returned her to where she had always been internally. The air around her felt clearer, not lighter, but defined, like a line had been drawn and finally seen. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he was, the phone still in his hand. Though the call had quieted into a background presence, the voice of Captain Rebecca Hayes no longer speaking, but still there, still listening, still shaping everything without needing to interrupt. The two observing officers continued their work with the same measured precision, one stepping slightly closer to the patrol car, adjusting their angle to review the dashboard camera feed more carefully, while the other remained near the ground, eyes fixed on the position of the small plastic bag, documenting its exact placement in relation to everything else. "Visual alignment confirmed," one of them said quietly, the words landing without emphasis but carrying finality. The other responded just as calmly, "No deviation from initial frame." Brooks heard it again, the language no longer abstract, no longer procedural, but narrowing into something specific, something that left less and less space for interpretation. His shoulders felt heavier now, not from the weight of the uniform, but from the stillness he was required to maintain. Every instinct that once guided him forward now held him in place. Ava's gaze moved slowly across the scene, not searching, not reacting, simply observing, as if she was witnessing the full shape of something that had only partially revealed itself before. Her eyes paused briefly on the patrol car camera, then on the officers, then finally on Brooks again. There was no change in her expression, but the silence between them had shifted. It no longer asked anything. It reflected. One of the officers stepped back slightly, turning their attention fully toward Brooks now. Their posture remained neutral, but their presence carried a different weight than before. "Officer Brooks," they said, voice even, "we are concluding preliminary verification." Brooks nodded once, the motion slower this time, more deliberate, as if even acknowledgement required thought now. "Understood," he replied, his voice steady but quieter than it had been at the start of the stop. The officer held his gaze for a brief moment, then continued. "Based on recorded footage and observed sequence, the item on the ground does not demonstrate origin from Miss Carter's possession." The statement was not raised. It did not need to be. It settled into the space with clarity that did not require repetition. Ava did not react outwardly. She did not exhale sharply or shift her stance in relief. She simply remained still, absorbing the words the same way she had absorbed everything else, calmly, completely. Brooks felt something shift inside him then, not sudden, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a structure he had relied on had quietly lost its foundation. He did not argue. He did not correct. There was nothing left that could be reshaped without conflicting with what had already been captured. The second officer spoke next, their tone just as measured. All documentation will be forwarded for formal review, they said. At this time, scene integrity has been maintained and sequence is verified. Another step completed. Another line drawn. Ava's eyes lowered briefly to the ground once more, to the object that had defined the moment just minutes ago, then lifted again, her focus steady, her breathing even. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement, but it felt larger now, noticeable in a way it had not been before. The space did not move with him. It held him exactly where he was. The officer nearest him took a small step closer, not to confront, but to finalize presence. You will remain available for further instruction, they said. Brooks nodded again. Yes. No hesitation. No resistance. Just acceptance. The crowd remained silent, but their presence felt different now, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting for something to happen, but recognizing that something already had. Phone stayed raised, capturing not action, but resolution. Ava's gaze moved one last time across the scene, then settled forward, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet but undeniable. She had not raised her voice. She had not resisted. She had not needed to. The truth had not been something she forced into the moment. It had been something she allowed the moment to reveal. The flashing lights continued behind them, but now they felt distant, like echoes instead of signals. And in the center of it all, the silence no longer carried tension. It carried conclusion. The silence did not break with noise. It shifted with understanding. Ava Carter stood in the same place, her posture unchanged, her hands resting naturally at her sides, but the space around her no longer held tension. It held clarity. The flashing lights still moved across the pavement, across the cars, across the faces of the people watching, but now they felt distant, like a backdrop instead of a force. Officer Daniel Brooks remained still, the phone still in his hand, though the weight of it felt different now, less like a tool and more like a reminder of everything that had already been said, recorded, and confirmed. The observing officers exchanged a brief glance, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to signal that a transition point had been reached. One of them stepped slightly forward, their voice calm, steady, carrying just enough to be heard clearly by everyone present. Officer Brooks, they said, based on verified footage and confirmed sequence, your report will require immediate review. Brooks nodded once, slower than before, his eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, not searching, not resisting, just acknowledging. Understood, he replied. The word came out evenly, but something beneath it had changed. It was no longer a response given from authority. It was one given from position. Ava's gaze moved toward the officer speaking, then back to Brooks, her expression still calm, still grounded, unchanged from the moment she first stepped out of her car. She did not step forward. She did not speak. She did not need to. The truth had already moved through the scene without her pushing it. The second officer shifted their attention toward Ava then, their tone softening slightly, not out of sympathy, but respect. Miss Carter, they said, you are no longer being detained. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not because they were loud, but because they completed something that had been building from the very first moment. Ava nodded once. No visible relief. No reaction beyond acknowledgement. Just acceptance of what had already been true. She took a small breath, steady, controlled, and remained where she was, not rushing to leave, not stepping away from the moment that had just resolved itself around her. Brooks watched that, his gaze lingering for a second longer than before, as if trying to understand something that had never been explained to him directly. The officer nearest the patrol car spoke again, their voice precise, final. All recordings will be submitted to internal affairs for formal evaluation. Another step. Another line. No emotion attached. Just process. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, the movement subtle, but noticeable now in the stillness that surrounded him. His eyes moved briefly toward the ground, toward the object that had once defined his version of the moment, then away again, as if it no longer held the same meaning. Ava followed that glance for just a fraction of a second, then returned her gaze forward. She did not need to hold on to it. It no longer held on to her. One of the officers stepped closer to Brooks, not aggressively, not abruptly, but with quiet authority. You will remain on site pending further instruction, they said. Brooks nodded again. Yes. No hesitation. No pushback. The structure of the moment had fully shifted. The crowd remained silent, but their presence felt different now. Not curious. Not uncertain. Certain. Phones still raised, capturing not escalation, but resolution. Ava took one slow step back, just enough to create space between herself and the center of the scene, not retreating, not distancing, just repositioning naturally now that the weight had lifted from her place within it. The flashing lights continued behind her, but they no longer framed her. They framed everything else. Brooks remained in place, the badge still on his chest, the phone still in his hand, but the meaning of both had changed in a way that could not be undone. The officer who had first spoken turned slightly, addressing the scene as a whole, their voice calm, controlled, final. This interaction is now under review. The words did not echo. They settled. Ava's eyes lifted once more, briefly meeting Brooks, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with something quieter, something steadier. Recognition. Then she looked away, not needing anything more from the moment. And for the first time since the lights had come on, the scene did not feel like something happening. It felt like something completed. The air did not rush back in. It remained steady, measured, like the moment itself had decided not to dissolve, but to settle deeper into everything it had just revealed. Ava Carter stood a few steps back now, no longer at the center, but not removed either, her presence still anchored to the scene in a way that did not require position. Her hands rested naturally, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, as if the outcome had never been in question for her, only the process of letting it unfold. The flashing lights continued behind her, but they no longer defined her place within the moment. They defined everything else. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he had been instructed, his posture upright, but no longer firm in the way it had been before. The difference was subtle, almost invisible to someone not paying close attention, but it was there in the way his shoulders carried weight, in the way his gaze no longer moved with certainty, but with awareness. The phone in his hand felt unnecessary now, but he did not lower it. He held it, as if letting go would mean acknowledging something he was not yet ready to name. One of the observing officers stepped slightly to the side, repositioning not to change the scene, but to complete it. Their voice remained calm, steady, each word chosen not for impact, but for accuracy. Final visual documentation in progress, they said. The other officer nodded once, eyes moving across the scene, confirming what had already been established. No alterations observed. The words landed quietly, but they carried the weight of closure. Brooks heard them. He could not avoid it. Each statement now felt less like observation and more like confirmation, each one narrowing the space between what had happened and what could no longer be reframed. Ava's gaze drifted briefly toward the officers, then back toward Brooks, not to challenge, not to question, but to acknowledge the shared presence in a moment that had shifted both of their positions in ways that did not need explanation. The crowd remained still, their phones still raised, but their movements minimal now, as if even they understood that the moment did not require commentary, only witness. The officer nearest Brooks spoke again, their tone unchanged, but their focus direct. Officer Brooks, you will be required to provide a formal statement following this interaction. Brooks nodded once. Yes, he said, the word quiet, grounded, no longer carrying the tone of command, but of compliance. The officer held his gaze for a second longer, then stepped back, returning to a neutral stance, allowing the structure already in place to carry forward. Ava shifted her weight slightly, a small, natural movement, as if her body was adjusting to the absence of pressure that had once been directed at her. She did not rush to leave. She did not step away from the scene entirely. Instead, she remained present, as if understanding that the moment was not something to escape, but something to witness fully, even now. Brooks' eyes moved again, briefly toward the ground, toward the object that had initiated everything, then away, his gaze lifting instead toward the patrol car, toward the camera that had recorded it all without interruption, without bias. For the first time, his focus lingered there, as if recognizing the permanence of what had been captured. The officer near the patrol car spoke softly, their voice steady, final. Recording remains intact. Another confirmation. Another line completed. Ava's eyes followed that direction for a brief moment, then returned forward, her expression unchanged, but her presence steady in a way that did not need to be asserted. The flashing lights continued, but now they felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the real moment had already passed, leaving behind only its record. Brooks stood in the center of it, not moving, not speaking, his position fixed not by command, but by the structure that now surrounded him. The difference between before and now was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was precise. Ava took another slow breath, her chest rising and falling evenly, her gaze lifting once more, not toward anyone in particular, but forward, grounded in the space that now felt clear. She had not argued. She had not resisted. She had allowed the moment to reveal itself, and in doing so, she had never needed to take control of it. The officer who had first addressed Brooks turned slightly, their voice carrying just enough to settle across the scene one last time. Documentation complete. The words were simple, but they carried finality, not as an ending, but as a confirmation that nothing further was needed to understand what had already been shown. Ava remained still for a moment longer, then let her gaze move away, no longer holding the scene in front of her, because it no longer needed to be held. And in that quiet shift, the moment did not fade. It remained, fully formed, exactly as it had been revealed. Nothing rushed forward to fill the space after the final words were spoken. The scene did not dissolve. It remained intact, held together by everything that had just been confirmed. Ava Carter stood still for a moment longer, her presence no longer anchored by tension, but by something quieter, something steadier. Like the ground beneath her had finally revealed its shape. The flashing lights continued behind her, but they no longer reached her in the same way. They passed over her, through her, without changing anything. Officer Daniel Brooks remained where he was, his posture upright, but no longer defined by control. The shift was not visible in any single movement, but it existed in the absence of what had once been automatic. His gaze no longer moved with direction. It rested, paused, returned, as if every glance now required thought. The phone in his hand felt out of place, but he still held it, his fingers wrapped around it not out of purpose, but habit. One of the observing officers stepped slightly forward, not to change the scene, but to transition it. Their voice remained calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach both Ava and Brooks without breaking the quiet that had settled over everything. "Miss Carter," they said, "you are free to leave when you are ready." The words were simple, but they carried something deeper than release. They acknowledged her position not as something that had just changed, but as something that had been clarified. Ava did not move immediately. She nodded once, a small, controlled motion, then let her gaze move across the scene one final time. Not searching, not holding, just seeing. The patrol car, the flashing lights, the officers, the small object on the ground that no longer defined anything. Then her eyes returned briefly to Brooks. There was no accusation there. No need for it. Only recognition of the moment they had both stood inside. Then she looked away. She took one step forward. Then another. Her movement was unhurried, natural, as if she was not leaving something behind, but simply continuing from where she had always been. The crowd shifted slightly as she passed, not closing in, not stepping forward, just making space, their phones still raised, their silence still intact. No one spoke. No one needed to. The moment had already said everything. Brooks watched her move, his eyes following for a second longer than necessary, as if something in that quiet departure held more weight than everything that had come before it. But he did not speak. He did not call out. There was nothing left that required his voice. The observing officers remained in position, their work complete, but their presence still steady, still structured. One of them turned slightly toward Brooks again, their tone unchanged. "You will remain available for follow-up?" they said. Brooks nodded once. "Yes." The word came out low, even, grounded in acceptance rather than response. The officer did not press further. They did not need to. The structure around the moment had already been set. Ava reached the edge of the scene, the flashing lights now fully behind her, no longer touching her at all. She paused for a brief second, not turning back, not hesitating, just allowing the stillness to pass through her one last time. Then she continued forward, stepping into the night beyond the lights, beyond the scene, without urgency, without weight. Behind her, everything remained. The patrol cars, the officers, the cameras still recording, Brooks still standing in place, the small objects still on the ground. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been undone. But everything had changed. The difference was not in what remained visible. It was in what had been revealed. Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, the first clear downward movement he had made since the moment shifted, his eyes resting not on any one thing, but on the space itself, as if trying to understand how it had changed without moving. The answer was not there. It had never been there. It had been in the sequence, in the silence, in the alignment that had formed without asking for permission. One of the officers spoke quietly into their radio, confirming completion, their voice low, professional, closing the loop that had begun when the lights first came on. The flashing lights continued their rhythm, but now they felt like echoes, repeating something that had already finished. And in the center of it all, where control had once stood, only stillness remained, steady and undeniable. The street did not return to normal. Not right away. It held the shape of what had happened, like heat lingering in pavement long after the sun had gone down. The flashing lights continued, slower now in perception, softer somehow, though nothing about them had actually changed. Officer Daniel Brooks stood exactly where he had been, but the space around him no longer belonged to him. It had shifted, quietly, completely, into something that no longer responded to his presence. The observing officers remained calm, their work done, their posture relaxed but still precise. Like they were part of a system that did not rush endings, only confirmed them. One of them bent slightly to retrieve the small plastic bag from the ground. Using a glove, placing it carefully into an evidence pouch, without ceremony, without emphasis, just procedure. The object that had once held the center of the moment now looked smaller, reduced, like it had lost the weight it never truly had. Brooks watched that movement, his eyes following it not with authority, but with distance, like he was observing something that no longer connected to him in the way it had minutes before. The phone in his hand finally lowered, slowly, almost unconsciously, until it rested at his side. The line had gone silent, but its presence remained, like a voice that no longer needed to speak to be heard. One of the officers stepped closer to him again, not to confront, not to correct, but to close the loop. "You will be contacted with next steps," they said, their tone even, professional, final. Brooks nodded once. Understood. The word came out steady, but it carried something different now, not just acceptance, but recognition, quiet and complete. The crowd began to shift, slowly, like a tide pulling back. Phones lowered. People turned. The circle that had formed without permission now dissolved just as quietly, each person carrying away their own version of what they had witnessed. No one spoke loudly. No one needed to. The moment had already been recorded in more ways than one. In the distance, a car door closed. Somewhere, an engine started. Life moved, but it did not erase what had just settled into place. Brooks remained still for another second, then another, his eyes lifting briefly toward the direction Ava Carter had walked. She was no longer visible. Only the empty stretch of sidewalk remained, lit faintly by streetlights and reflections that no longer held her shape. He did not move toward it. He did not call after her. He simply looked, then let his gaze fall away, back to the ground, to the space that had changed without ever moving. The observing officers turned slightly, one speaking quietly into a radio, confirming completion, their voice low, controlled, part of a system that would continue long after this street returned to quiet. The other adjusted the evidence pouch, sealing it, labeling it, turning something that had been used as a claim into something that would now be examined as fact. Brooks exhaled slowly, the first full breath he had taken in what felt like longer than he could measure. His shoulders lowered just slightly, not in relief, but in release, like something he had been holding without realizing it had finally let go. The flashing lights continued their rhythm behind him, but now they felt like echoes, repeating something that had already passed. He glanced once more at the patrol car, at the camera mounted inside, at the small blinking light that had never stopped, never hesitated, never chosen a side. It had simply seen, and that had been enough. The officers began to step away, not abruptly, not all at once, but in the same measured way they had arrived. Their presence no longer needed to hold the moment together. It was already complete. Brooks remained for a second longer, then shifted his weight, a small movement, grounding himself again in the physical world that had not changed, even as everything else had. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, stretching shapes that did not move when he did. He looked at them, just for a second, then away. No words came. None were needed. The moment had not ended with sound. It ended with understanding. And somewhere beyond the reach of the lights, beyond the cameras, beyond the space that had held him still, Ava Carter kept walking, unchanged by what had been done, but remembered by what had been revealed. He had worn the badge, but she had carried the truth. And in the end, it was the truth that stayed.